The United Kingdom is an island nation in Western Europe. The UK is a global great power, but it wasn't always this way. The UK used to be the sole superpower of the world and ruled over 531 million people and 25% of the Earth's surface. The foundation for this empire was laid way back in the 15th century when England and Scotland were both independent nations. In 1947, after both Spain and Portugal had success in overseas exploration and colonization, King Henry VII sent John Cabot to lead an exploration to Asia through the North Atlantic. 5 years after Christopher Columbus's expedition, Cabot landed on the coast of Newfoundland. He believed that he had reached Asia and promptly returned to England. The following year, he made another expedition, although this time he did not return. His ships still have not been found. No attempts at colonization were made until the late 16th century. The Protestant Reformation left Spain and England as enemies. In 1562, Elizabeth I sent privateers John Hawkins and Francis Drake to engage in slave-raiding attacks against Spanish and Portuguese ships west of Africa that were trying to establish an Atlantic slave trade. Spanish forts in America were destroyed. Many influential writers such as Richard Hakluyt and John Dee called for an empire. Spain had already become the dominant American power with Portugal, and France also owning many colonies. Following the rest of Europe's lead, they colonized parts of Ireland known as the Ulster Plantation. In 1578, Humphrey Gilbert was granted a patent for overseas exploration. Gilbert made expeditions to the Caribbean, engaging in piracy and setting up a colony in North America. They also established the Roanoke colony. After the Treaty of London with Spain, England began to focus on Western colonization. They founded many colonies in the Caribbean and established the East India Company to administer the colonies. This period was known as the First British Empire. Many American colonies failed, such as the colonies in Guyana, St. Lucia, and Grenada. Some settlements were established in St. Kitts, Barbados, and Nevis throughout the early 17th century. These colonies adopted sugar plantations depending on slave labor. The first permanent colony in the Americas was established in Jamestown, led by Captain John Smith. Parliament later decided that the colonies could only trade with English ships, leading to the Anglo-Dutch Wars. Many more colonies were later set up outside of Virginia, such as Maryland, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Carolina, and after the surrender of Fort Amsterdam, the English gained New Netherland, which was renamed to New York. The Dutch also handed over Suriname. The colony of Pennsylvania was also established in 1681. The American colonies were not as profitable as the Caribbean, but had valuable land used for farming. The Hudson Bay Company was established in 1670, later forming the Dominion of Canada. A few years later, the Royal African Company was established, gaining a monopoly over the slave trade until it was abolished in 1807. The English and Dutch both wanted in to Portugal's lucrative spice trade, with all three competing with each other. In 1688, William of Orange took the English throne, granting peace between the Netherlands and England. This left the two as allies in the 9 Years' War against France and Spain. Meanwhile, in 1695, Scotland established the Isthmus of Panama, which was later abandoned. This ended hopes of the Scottish Empire until the personal union with England. The 18th century saw a united Great Britain rise into the dominant colonial power we think of today. After the end of the War of Spanish Succession, Spain lost its empire. Gibraltar became a critical naval base in the Mediterranean. In 1739, Spain attacked British merchants along triangular trade routes. This led to the negotiations of Britain losing its slave raiding rights in South America in exchange for peace. The mid-18th century saw many military outbreaks in the Indian subcontinent. The British gained control over India. This caused the 7 Years' War. After the war, Britain gained French lands in North America. The British were broke and began taxing American colonies, causing the American Revolution. I won't say too much about this war as I feel it deserves its own video. However, it ended in a British defeat and the loss of the United States. This is seen as a transition between the First and Second British Empire. During the Napoleonic Wars, tensions again rose between the British and the United States, as Britain tried to block off American trade with France. The U.S. declared war and invaded Canada. The U.S. gained more territory, and the British sought land elsewhere. So-called elsewhere became Australia. In 1770, James Cook reached Australia and claimed it for Great Britain. The British ended up sending many convicts to Australia. James Cook also claimed New Zealand and Tasmania. The Australian colonies became very profitable. After the Napoleonic Wars, France ceded the Ionian Islands, Malta, Mauritius, St. Lucia, the Seychelles, and Tobago to Great Britain. In 1834, slavery was abolished in the British Empire. The British later gained the Asian lands of Java, Penang Island, Singapore, Malacca, and Burma. They also gained Egypt, and then India rebelled in 1857. Also, the British started importing tea from Asia, so that's cool, I guess. Throughout the 19th century, the British got into a fierce rivalry with Russia, known as the Great Game. Russia had defeated Britain in Persia and Turkey, striking fear into Britain. An invasion of Afghanistan failed for the British. Britain acquired the Cape Colony. The Suez Canal was opened, and the British were originally blocked from it. Britain later gained leverage over the canal. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 was held to regulate African colonization and the scramble for Africa. This brought the British African territories to this. In 1867, the province of Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia were formed into a more independent Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Were also given more autonomy and then independence after 1900. By the 20th century, Britain became worried that it wouldn't be able to defend the whole empire. Germany had rapidly been rising as a military power until the First World War. Britain quickly grabbed Germany's African colonies. After Germany's defeat and the Treaty of Versailles, the British Empire reached its greatest extent. The colonies of the Ottoman Empire and Germany were handed over to Allied powers after the formation of the League of Nations. Britain gained control over Palestine, Transjordan, Iraq, and parts of Togoland, Cameroon, and Tanganyika. The changing world order, independence movements, and countries like the United States rising in power and influence required a reassessment of the empire as a whole. They established the Commonwealth of Nations, which were free nations that were still somewhat controlled by the British Crown. After the Second World War, the UK came up upon a period of decolonization and decline. Anti-colonial movements gained many countries' independence. By 1981, all that was left was a few islands. The Falkland Wars saw a dispute between Argentina and the UK over the Falkland Islands. In 1992, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher traveled to Beijing to negotiate the last true piece of the British Empire, Hong Kong. A ceremony was held where it was famously stated, "The sun has now set upon the British Empire." The legacy of the British Empire is unrivaled even to this day. It was the empire in which the sun never sets because they owned territory in every time zone. The empire's influence was vast, and to this day, English is the most widely spoken language across the globe, with 1.5 billion speakers. Even today, the British Empire is still very influential. Thank you all so much for watching this video. This is the first video on this channel. And I just wanted to thank, everyone who watched this. Please like the video if you enjoyed it. And subscribe so I can do more things like this. Maybe I can do the French Empire or the Spanish Empire. Or maybe I could just do, other history-related things that aren't empires. Leave below suggestions in the comment section to tell me what you want to see. So, thank you so much for watching. It's been George. Goodbye.